The 1960s were a time of suburban peace in Middle America. Well, for rich white people anyway. It was also the time of various civil rights movements that completely changed the structure of what we now know as normal. The elderly of the 60s were just recovering from the impact of World War II. The youth of the 60s were all rock stars and hippies who just really wanted to push social boundaries. And the automotive industry in Detroit was booming. Though the 1960s weren't all sunshine and rainbows, quite the contrary in fact. Here are 5 creepy facts about the 1960s that will likely make you squirm. Before we get into this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment below. Number 5. Some of the most notorious American serial killers were actively free and simultaneously committing their crimes across America in the 1960s. Long before we had advanced technologies that could easily catch suspects, serial killers in the 1960s were thriving. If you were a kid in the 1960s walking around and minding your own business, you could have potentially crossed paths with Charles Manson, the Zodiac Killer, the Boston Strangler, John Wayne Gacy, all serial killers that were committing their acts simultaneously here in America. Some people think that the reason serial killers thrived so much in the 60s and some of the 70s was the amount of trust people used to have in strangers. People were far more trustworthy of a random guy than they are now. It was really easy using charm and manipulation for these serial killers to lure young boys or little girls into their traps, and a lot of them fell for it. Luckily, current technology would make it damn near impossible for this many brutal and prolific serial killers to be running around. It doesn't happen like that anymore. Birth control was illegal to advertise. Before 1965, which really wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things, birth control was heavily shunned here in the United States. Advertising it could result in fines or even jail time. In fact, certain states like Connecticut literally outlawed the use of contraceptives altogether in the 60s, though not really sure how that one would be monitored. Birth control was still readily available long before 1965, but it wasn't mainstream, and very few knew about it, and very few knew about safe sex, because most people were stuck in the status quo, which was heavily against any type of contraceptives whatsoever. It's pretty scary to think that only 60 years ago we had these draconian laws and rules set by these religious freaks, and I say that as a Christian man myself. The Ku Klux Klan we know of now was rampant in the 1960s, a time they actually thrived in. See, the 1960s saw many cultural civil rights movements relating to African Americans and LGBTQ people. Martin Luther King Jr. was at his peak here, though unfortunately, because of all these civil rights movements were coming about, there were quite a bit of counterculture movements popping up relating to stopping these civil rights movements, and one of the worst ones was the KKK. Places like North Carolina in the 1960s were infested with KKK members, and unfortunately many individuals at the time believed a lot of the garbage that came out of the KKK members' mouths, and culture was generally just far more racist than it is today. The KKK was also immensely criminally active in the 1960s, with the organization committing dozens of murders, church burnings, and more in places like South and North Carolina. The KKK still exists to this day, but it has nothing on what it used to be in the 60s. Number 2. Homosexuals were seen as devious degenerates, and they frequently had PSAs made about them in the 60s, warning people to stay away from them. Homosexuality was incredibly taboo in the 1960s, and it was nearly unheard of in mainstream culture. The concept of homosexuality was so primitive to the average man in the 60s that gay jokes and gay-related slurs didn't even exist yet. Gay meant happy back then. Homosexuality was legitimately considered a mental illness. And I shit you not, there were a ton of PSAs out discussing how dangerous they were.
But Bill had a handicap. That handicap was Bill was a homosexual.
Let's just say the gays did not have an easy time in the 1960s. Number 1. Pedophilia and child molestation was incredibly common, yet hardly discussed. Nowadays, everyone knows about stranger danger and keeping their kids safe from creeps, but back in the 1960s, well, it was a time of suburban bliss. People were delusional, and many well-off individuals at the time were religious. Though unbeknownst to them, there were a lot of crimes being committed against children from priests in churches across America. The Catholic religion dominated most of America in the 1960s, and because of how immensely popular it was, people often overlooked a lot of its flaws. Little did these parents and grandparents who took their kids to these churches know, there was an alarmingly large amount of priests sexually molesting and raping children at the time. But back in the day, you didn't dare speak out about this or you'd be outcasted. You'd be seen as a sacrilegious nut that deserves to be locked up. You'd probably be exiled from your community. As of today, there's a horrifyingly large amount of people who in the 60s suffered disgusting sexual abuse at the hands of priests who may still be priests to this day. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you do, and stay tuned for more movies.